a series of recent studies that we are doing looking at motor learning in children, but also in looking at the effects of musical training early in life on adult performance. And then I'm going to add, if we have time, just a little bit at the end, because when I spoke with Julia and Marco and some other people, I realized that there's another aspect of what we're doing on gesture imitation that people might be interested in. So I'll just give you a little tiny bit on that. Yeah, oh yeah. If there's anything that you don't understand, because I'm going to try to do a little bit of background and everything, please don't hesitate. So I always like to give a little global idea of what it is that we're doing, and I found this wonderful song from the Chiripiti Flauticos, and they said that and I just love saying Chiripiti Flautico, and they said that they had a song in one of their things that said, La cabeza es una caja muy dura, pero dentro tiene un plan. And I loved this, and I thought this is what because they had an interview with the woman in La Vanguardia, and she was telling about this song that they have. And when I teach neuropsychology, I always tell the students in my class, that you should wear a helmet when you're on your motorcycle, because your skull is very hard and inside your brain is soft. And in English, I always tell them that your brain is like cold oatmeal, which is probably something that none of you guys know anything about. But in Spanish, it makes a lot of sense to say that your brain is like a flan, right? And this was the idea, in fact, of their song, is they were trying to convince kids not to like whack each other over the head. So, can you sing this one? Because I looked very hard for a recording and I couldn't find one. So the real goal of our research is to understand the flan, right? So I think what I'm going to be talking about today is how we can look at the interaction between experience, predisposition or genetic components, and development. So I'll give you a little bit of background. All of these things have been looked at separately, so how the brain changes with development, how individual differences in brain structure can be related to particular abilities, and how the brain changes when you have particular kinds of experience, whether it's playing the cello or playing soccer. And what we in particular want to be able to do is to look at the interaction. What do I have to do? Okay. And the way that we're going to look at this interaction, or the example of this kind of interaction, is a very particular one that's called a sensitive period. And I'll talk about this, or I'll define this more later on. But it's the idea that there's a limited time during development where particular experience, so training or other kinds of experience, has enhanced or particular effects, and that those effects are long-lasting. So that effect during a period in childhood is actually going to affect or continue to affect your performance or your ability to do things later on in life. And that these effects, of course, occur, or we can see them both in behavior and in the brain. So what I'm going to talk about today here are differences in adult musical performance between early and late trained musicians. And I'll just emphasize that sometimes people are confused that we're looking at children, but in these studies we're looking at adults, but they began their training either early or late. Then I'm going to talk about some age-related differences in motor performance in children that we think are related to that. And then structural brain differences between these early and late trained musicians that is a part of an ongoing study. So what's some of the information that we already have? So there are a number of studies that look at the relationship between individual differences in brain structure and your ability to perform a particular kind of task. So this is an example, a musical example from some work that one of Robert's students did that shows us that gray matter concentration in this particular region of auditory cortex is related to people's ability to perform a pitch judgment task. So these are people who, some of whom have some or considerable musical training, some of them have no musical training. It's just a sample of individuals, and it's telling us that your ability to do this judgment task is related to the concentration of gray matter in that particular auditory region of your brain. So this is saying that there are individual differences, which we kind of already know, right, that are related to brain structure. And I think probably some of you who study language know about some other kinds of studies where they've looked at and seen differences in brain structure related to people's ability to learn foreign language sounds. This is a structural MRI measure, so it's just looking at brain structure. And most of the examples, thank you, most of the examples that I'm going to give today are about brain structure rather than about brain function. This is an example of some of the kinds of work that's being done more recently looking at changes with development. So this image is showing you particular regions of the brain that show large degree of change across development. So these are in children between 4 and 17 years of age. And what this is illustrating is that these regions in the descending motor pathways show large degree of change over age range in these children. So what it's telling us is that these descending motor pathways that are really important for fine motor control are continuing to develop from young childhood all the way through into adolescence. And that's going to be really important, I think, for some of the studies that I'm going to present. So this is the idea that we can use structural MRI to see changes in structure that occur with development. So here we have individual differences, here we have development. And this is work from one of our colleagues, Krista Hyde and Gottfried Schlaug, that shows changes in brain structure that are related to experience. So these are children who received 15 months of piano training. And what this shows us is that in right precentral gyrus, so this is part of the motor system, that you show greater changes in this region of the brain before and after training, or before and after this 15-month period for kids who got the training, so those are the black dots, than for kids who didn't get the training. So what this is showing us is that you can get, actually over a relatively short period of time, changes in brain structure that are specifically related to a particular kind of experience. So what I've shown you now, right, are these three streams: individual differences, changes with development, and changes with training. So our goal, like I said, is to try to look at some of these interactions. So the context that I want to look at this interaction is what we call a sensitive period. And I want to kind of give you a definition of what I'm talking about here, because I think that it's often a little bit confusing in the literature, this idea of sensitive period and the idea of critical period. So I'm going to define sensitive period as a developmental window where specific experience has enhanced long-lasting effects on behavior in the brain. And I just want to emphasize that this is not a critical period. So a critical period is a window in development where if you do not get this experience, some function or another does not develop. So if you don't get it, you lose it. It's an on or off kind of thing. And the really, the most simplest example is ocular dominance columns. So if you blind a kitten or cover its eyes so that it can't use both of its eyes together early in development, if you remove the eye patch, nothing has happened to the eye. The brain is not able to develop these ocular dominance columns if the experience doesn't happen during this critical window. So what we're talking about here is not something like a critical window where if you don't get musical training, you're never going to be able to develop it. We're talking about more of a spectrum. So the idea of a sensitive period is that you have graded effects. It's not an all or nothing. But it is true, very similar to the critical period, that this is partly under genetic control. So, you know, I know this is very simplistic, but genes control brain development. Experience interacts with genes, and during this window, or you have this window that's occurring at relatively the same time for all. So the idea is that, of course, there's a genetic basis to when this sensitive period window might be, but it's more malleable probably than, or more broad than a critical window. But part of the reason that we can say that it's probably partly under genetic control is that the window is relatively consistent for everybody. Now, of course, the other side of this is experience. And the thing to remember is that this kind of sensitive period, or even a critical period, getting the appropriate experience can open the window. So getting the particular sensory experience encourages these genetic events to occur, to open the window. And similarly, if you do not get the experience during a window, this can close that window, so it can reduce sensitivity or it can reduce plasticity. So what kinds of evidence are out there sort of in the world for sensitive periods? One of the most well-studied examples, particularly recently, is the study of cochlear implants for children who are born deaf. And what this graph is showing us is that children who receive cochlear implants at 18 months or at 20 months here, at 24 months, at 12 months or at 18 months, develop better language skills later on at 3 and 4 years old than kids who were implanted later. So in fact, what they're showing here is that for children who are implanted at 12 months, they actually are reaching the levels of normal 3 and 5-year-olds by the time they reach that same age. So whereas these kids, they are developing language, but you can see that the trajectory of this line is still going to put them slightly below the level of normal kids at that same age range. So this is a really good example of a sensitive period. Another example of a sensitive period that you guys may be familiar with is the one for second language learning. And this is just showing you sort of a mean grammatical performance score in your second language. I'm pretty sure it was English. This is the native speakers. These are people who began to acquire the language between 3 and 7, and these between 8 and 10. And here's 11 to 15, 17 to 30. And what this is showing you is that on average, adult language ability is better for those who begin learning before this 8 to 10 period. This is a global score on, I don't know a whole lot about the particular type of test. This is relatively old data, but it's a combined score. It's like word knowledge, grammar, syntax, and a bunch of things all combined together. So this is a very relatively simple graph to illustrate the concept. There is a lot of information, and probably a lot of you know it better than I do, about the particular aspects of second language that are most susceptible to this effect. And there's also a lot of controversy about this effect, so I'm not trying to say, but I think it's fairly, I think most of us know that for certain aspects of language, this probably holds true. Okay. So what about evidence for a real sensitive period for musical training? There's a lot of anecdotal evidence, and probably if any of you have children or if you yourself ever took music lessons, everybody told you the earlier the better, right? If you want your child to really learn, they should start early. And we have a lot of good examples. Yo-Yo Ma began at age 4. Oscar Peterson, the famous Canadian jazz pianist, began at 5. Pablo Casals was apparently able to play the recorder, the violin, and the piano at the age of 4. although he did not start playing the cello until he was something like 11. Yeah, his dad made him a cello. Yeah. So what kinds of evidence do we have beyond these stories? Well, one of the examples is from absolute pitch. So absolute pitch is also known as perfect pitch. This is the ability to hear a sound without any context and to name that note. And what this graph is showing you is from a very large sample of musicians. They looked at like 600 or 700 musicians. Those who had absolute pitch, 78% of them, so most of the people who actually had absolute pitch, began their training before the age of 6. And there's also some evidence from absolute pitch that there's probably some kind of genetic contribution. Absolute pitch actually looks a little bit more like that kind of critical period effect, where really, after age this 6 to 9, you get nothing. No one, or very, very few people develop this ability. So what evidence do we have for brain changes related to this sensitive period? Probably one of the most well-known studies is from Gottfried's lab, where they looked at measurements of the surface area of the corpus callosum, so that region of the brain that connects the two hemispheres and allows transfer of information, probably really important for using your two hands if you're a musician. And what they showed is that overall, in musicians, the anterior part of the corpus callosum, so the front bit, is larger for musicians, and in particular, that this region was incrementally larger for those musicians who began their training before the age of 7. More recently, this is another structural MRI study, and what this is showing is that musicians had a greater degree of myelination in these, again, these descending motor pathways, so musicians greater than non-musicians, but that very importantly, the degree of this myelination or coherence was related to the number of hours they practiced in childhood, and I think that it was the number of hours they practiced before the age of 10 or 11. So this is suggesting, again, this idea that practice in childhood is relevant for changes in brain structure. But the thing that we thought about this is that this stuff is very suggestive, very interesting, but there are no behavioral measures, right? So we don't know. Maybe they have this big corpus callosum, and who cares? It's a little bit bigger, but it doesn't really make any difference, right? And the most important thing is, for any of you who are developmental psychologists here, as you know, right, if you begin at age 5 and you're 20, you've been playing for 15 years. If you begin at age 8 and you're 20, well, you've only been playing for 12 years. So the big confound in all of these studies is there's no control for the length of experience, right? So maybe the reason why these people have this incrementally larger anterior corpus callosum is that they've been on average playing for longer, right? So this is what we set out to take a look at, was we wanted to look to see if you would get this kind of sensitive period effect, if you could see it behaviorally, and in particular, if you could see it when you controlled for experience, and we also controlled for other factors that we thought might be relevant. So what we did here is we took a matched sample of early and late trained musicians, and we used that cutoff from that study of the corpus callosum, age 7. And we said early trained is people who began before 7, late trained is those who began after 7. And we matched them for how many years of experience they had, how long they'd been playing, how much formal training they'd had, how many years of lessons had they had, and how much they currently practiced. So in other words, I think a lot of people might have thought, oh, those late trained musicians, they're just those guys who are playing electric guitar in a band and they don't really practice, right? So we matched them on that. And what we did with them, this may seem a little bit odd, the task that we used, but it was a task that we had used in other studies. So what we had them do is we had them practice tapping out a visual rhythm. So this is quite difficult. I'll show you what it looks like. So right down here in the corner, this is what they have to do. They have to watch this square, this target appearing on the screen, and they have to synchronize with it tapping on the computer mouse. So it's the real thing is a little bit longer. So it's what I would say is a complex visual rhythm. So it's an unusual task. It was designed for some motor learning studies. It was designed to be difficult to learn and difficult to perform so that we could get differences as people were trained. So what we did is we made these poor people do this for 5 days in a row. Because the other question that we also had is, well, maybe any differences that we might see between early and late trained musicians, they might be really small. And that, yes, if you tested them one day at one time, they'd be different. But if you gave them a chance to practice or to accustom themselves to the task, maybe that difference would go away. And again, it just wouldn't be that important. So we had them practice this task, and we had 2 different ways of scoring it. One was a simple percent correct. Did you make a short tap when you should have and a long tap when you should have? So a very global measure. And the second one was asking how well synchronized were you with the stimuli? How exact was the onset and the offset of your tap compared with what you saw on the screen? And what we found was that on the very first day of training for the percent correct, the early trained musicians did in fact outperform the late trained musicians and the non-musician controls. So they were better. But if you let everybody practice, then everyone caught up to the early trained musicians, right? So in this terms of this aspect of performance, it looks like being early trained gives you this little edge, but it doesn't last. In contrast, for the synchronization measure, you can see that both musician groups always outperform the non-musicians, but that on the first day they're equal. What happens then is that they separate, and for these 4 subsequent days of training, they stay different. So this is telling you that there's something that these early trained musicians can do that takes a little bit of time to develop, but the interesting thing is that they stay different than the late trained musicians. So it suggests that they are not only able to perform better, but they're actually able to improve more than these late trained musicians. And that performance on this task is relatively stable. So we were really happy with this result. We thought this was cool, but we presented it to many people, and probably you are sitting here asking yourself some of the same questions that people asked us, which is, these are visual rhythms, sort of. Would we see the same thing if we actually gave them something that's really more like music, which is what they're supposed to be good at anyway, right? So maybe it's just because this task is really weird, it's kind of difficult, and there's something extra that the early trained musicians bring to it. The other thing that people asked us is, well, maybe those early trained musicians are just kind of smarter, right? After all, they started musical training when they were younger. They were 4 or 5. Maybe being able to start early like that means that you have some extra ability that people who start later don't have, right? So these were the questions that we brought to the next experiment. So what we did here is we used a more ecologically valid task, although I guess you guys will have to be the judge of that. We had them listen to and reproduce auditory rhythms that varied in terms of their complexity. So I'm going to play you. We had 3 different types. One that was metrically simple, so it sounds like this. This is pretty easy to clap out or play along to. Then we had more complex. So this is like a syncopated rhythm. Those of you who are jazz musicians would be kind of fond of that. And then the last one is a non-metrical rhythm. And this is a rhythm that if you only hear it once, in other words, if it doesn't cycle, you can't predict where the beats should be. If you cycled it, you'd be able to break it up and find a way to. The idea here was to have enough range of difficulty that we could look at the performance of these two highly trained groups. And this is based on a task that was developed by Roberts and my joint student, Joyce Chen, who did a lot of really interesting studies on rhythm, perception, and production. So what we did here is we looked at that ability to, I seem to have lost this. We looked at the ability to tap along with this, and we used this similar kind of measure, which is how well did you synchronize your performance with what you should have done. And what we showed here is that really kind of similar to what you saw before, is that early and late trained musicians were able to globally perform equally well, but when it came to this fine synchronization of the movements, early trained musicians outperformed late trained musicians in the sense that they had less deviation from the correct intervals. And we also, similar to what we did before, matched them in terms of their age of onset, their years of experience, et cetera. So we were able to replicate what we had seen before, but now with these more familiar auditory stimuli. And the other thing that we looked at was performance on a number of cognitive kinds of tasks that we thought might be relevant. So we looked at vocabulary, sort of a global measure. We looked at matrix reasoning, a nonverbal measure of cognition. And we looked at digit span and letter number sequencing, so auditory working memory kinds of tasks. And we looked at them for both scaled and raw scores. So in other words, like, how are you compared to the normal population, and how big is your span really, kind of. And what we saw is that there were no differences between the groups for any of these cognitive variables. And I'll just tell you one thing that we did see that was quite interesting is that for everybody, performance on these auditory working memory tasks was related to performance, which kind of makes a lot of sense, right? Your ability to remember and tap along accurately with these rhythms, it seems like it should be related to something like auditory working memory. But it was not differentially predictive of performance for these early and late trained musicians. So again, what we have here is some real confirmation that these people do differ, and that what seems to be most relevant, sorry, not most relevant, but seems to differentiate the two groups the most is this accurate auditory motor integration, accurate motor performance. So I'll just let you know too, and I'll come back to this later, that we have a new sample of these early and late trained musicians with whom we're collecting structural MRI data, and I'm going to show you those results in a bit. But I just want to let you know that we've done the same thing, and we replicated the same results. So it seems to be quite robust. It's a small effect. So the other thing that I'll remind you, that I always remind people, is it is not the case, of course, that every early trained musician outperforms every late trained musician, right? There's quite a bit of overlap in terms of their performance. But on average, they do differ, and it seems to be a robust difference. So one of the other questions that we asked ourselves is that we used this cutoff that Schlaug had sort of put out there of age 7, but we didn't have a really good data-driven reason to use this. And we wondered, well, what could be happening around that period that might result in these kinds of differences? In other words, if you think that training during that early period gives you this advantage in terms of adult performance, then you would think that there's something going on in terms of kids' ability to either acquire the auditory or the motor component of the task that would be relevant, that would interact with the training to give you this effect. So what we asked about was sort of motor or motor/cognitive changes in their ability to acquire motor sequences. So we would like to, in the future, do some more things with auditory acquisition. I'm sort of a motor control person, so I came at this from a motor point of view. So the first thing that we really looked at was motor learning changes. So the idea here was to look at this sensitive period and to test motor learning in kids. We did this in a cross-sectional way where we looked at kids who were 6, 8, and 10. So sort of bracketing that 7-year cutoff. And the way we did this is that the kids, it's kids who are 6 and between 5 and 6, kids who are between 8 and 9, and kids who are between 10 and 11. So there's a year separation between each of the groups. And what we did here was we did a slightly different kind of a task. It's a variant on the classic serial reaction time task. So what they see is they see a display on the computer screen that has either Bubbles the fish or Rolly the hamster, and he hops from one block to the other, and the child has to follow the sequence using the keys on this little MIDI keyboard. And what we did was they practiced this 10-element sequence. We compared it to random control trials, which I won't present here, but there is a control for that. And we looked at 2 days of training because we were interested in that idea of initial acquisition, but also in terms of the consolidation or the change in the representation of the skill if you got to come back to it on a second day. Yeah. So what we showed is, again, we had the same idea of separating components of the task into a more global sequential component. So did you hit the right key, right? Did you get the right order of key presses? Percent correct. And then the more fine motor control component, how well did you synchronize your response with the timing of the stimulus on the screen? And what we showed here was, sorry, I don't know why I lost this. Maybe I did something. No, I wonder if I turned something off or on without, anyway, just because it's hard to point at it. But for the percent correct measure, what we saw is that you got rapid changes in learning for all of the groups. And in fact, the 10-year-olds were close to ceiling. They were indistinguishable from the adults on the very first day of learning. And even across days of learning, by the second day of training, the adults, the 10-year-olds, and the 8-year-olds were all performing at the same level. So it's saying that these kids were able to catch up. The only group that did not catch up in terms of this simple sequential component of the task were the 6-year-olds. So it's telling you that this aspect of the task seems to develop more rapidly. So in other words, younger kids are able to perform at the same level of adults relative to synchronization, where what we saw here is that even after 2 days of training, only the 10-year-olds caught up to the adults. So here, first day, second day, by the end of training on day 2, the 10-year-olds are performing at the same level as the adults, but the 6-year-olds and the 8-year-olds are still not performing at the same level. So relatively speaking, our idea was that for that more procedural or fine motor control component, this seems to develop later. So the younger kids are not able to catch up to the adults here. So this is kind of consistent with those structural changes that we saw. Oh, thank you. Great. For the, in those MRI studies showing that motor pathways continue to develop through adolescence. And it seems to suggest that this aspect of performance doesn't change as rapidly. So, and then I just thought I would put in here, we also wanted to be sure that there weren't big differences among the age groups in terms of their ability to sort of acquire the sequence. And we did a recall and a recognition task, and there was no difference, which we were actually relatively surprised about, between the kids and the adults in their ability to either recall, so how much of the sequence could they reproduce if you just said to them, put your hand on the keyboard and show me what you remember. People were uniformly quite bad at it. They only got about like the first 3 or 4 responses. But also everybody was able to recognize. So if you give them 3 choices, you show them one sequence, another sequence, and another sequence, everybody's pretty good at recognizing that the one that they actually did. So it doesn't seem that it's something about simple memory for the task that differentiates this performance between the child and adult groups. So what does this tell us? It seems to tell us that there's some sort of a developmental break point between 6 and 8. So this gives us a little bit of validation for that idea that there's something going on in terms of your ability to acquire motor sequences and to acquire this kind of like fine motor control or auditory motor, visual motor synchronization that's happening in that period. So sort of consistent with this 7-year cutoff for this early and late training. We'd like to do some more studies with these children to look more carefully at this because it's quite difficult. We use the exact same task for all of the kids in this study and the adults. So you can see that the adults are at ceiling. And the younger kids learn more because they're doing worse in the beginning. So the idea we're working on now is to try to create some tasks where everybody will start out in the same place, and then you can actually look at learning slope. But this has proved to be more difficult than we had originally thought it was. So it's in the works. Okay. So now I just want to talk about the last component of our study, which is now we're in collaboration with Robert and with researchers at the MNI. We're doing structural MRI studies in these musicians who've been trained early and late. So it's this new matched sample. And we're doing measures of structure, looking at gray matter and white matter. And we're looking at voxel-based morphometry, which tells you about concentration of gray matter and white matter, cortical thickness, which tells you how thick the gray matter is in particular places, DTI, which is really useful for looking at concentration of white matter, and magnetization transfer, which is another structural MRI technique that's particularly good for looking at myelin concentration specifically. So the idea here with this project is to really try to combine a series or a set of structural MRI measures to be able to get a better picture of what's happening in the brain. And then we're testing these early and late trained musicians on a battery of musical tasks because, of course, we've only ever done these rhythm synchronization things with them. So we're looking at them in terms of their pitch and melody transposition abilities. We're looking at the auditory and visual rhythm imitation. We're doing these cognitive measures, and we're also doing a control task, phoneme discrimination, which we think that they shouldn't really perform any better than anybody else in the general population. So we have some preliminary results here. Maybe I won't go into this since I want to be able to show you the imitation, but if anybody wants more details about the particular task that we're doing, you can ask them later. And what we've shown is on the left here, these are the results of some preliminary, so our preliminary sample of 12 early and 12 late trained musicians showing white matter differences in premotor cortex and also in parietal cortex here. And this is the result of a study from Joyce Chen where she showed when people are performing that rhythm synchronization task that I showed you, these are the regions of the brain that show greater activity when you are performing a more complex rhythm. So the differences between the early and late trained musicians seem to mirror some of the functional correlates that we've seen for this rhythm discrimination task. And similarly, what we're looking at here is the VBM data, so that same looking at concentration, in this case, of white matter, and here the magnetization transfer data, also looking at white matter. And what this is showing is that relative to an fMRI study, looking at this melody transposition task, the early trained musicians show a greater concentration of white matter and greater myelination or presence of myelin as measured by MT, in similar regions that were found to be active when musicians were asked to do this melody transposition task. And this, this data here is to show you that these early trained musicians, they're not just good at tapping along to things, they're also performing better than the late trained musicians on detecting transposition, detecting changes in a melody that's been transposed. So it's not the case, and I don't think we would have expected this, that the only thing these people perform somewhat differently on is this auditory motor component, but also in this pitch judgment task. So I think I can conclude by telling you that we seem to have some evidence from these studies for a possible sensitive period for musical training. It really looks like enhanced experience during this period can result in long-lasting changes, and that changes in brain structure appear to be in regions which have previously shown functional relationships to task performance. And we're really looking forward. We've just finalized the sample. We now have about 20 and 20 musicians, so we're really going to be able to push this quite a lot further. So the next part that I just wanted to do, maybe tell you a little bit about is, well, how could this happen, right? Why would this specific training during this period result in these kinds of differences? And this, there's probably two answers that you can give, right? One is bottom up, right? You get extra auditory, you get extra motor experience, and that changes your auditory regions or your motor regions. So the example here is from rats, and what they did is they exposed rat pups either between 9 and 13 days postpartum for 3 days. And what they showed is that they get a greater greater representation of that frequency range in their auditory cortex compared to naive rats, but only if they're exposed between this particular period. Okay? So this is showing you how intensive auditory exposure can result in this change in the auditory maps. A really interesting example of top-down influences comes from a study looking at brainstem responses to chords in musicians and non-musicians. And what they're showing you here, just very briefly, is that the accuracy of the following response of the brainstem is greater for musicians than non-musicians. This is the brainstem. So clearly, the brainstem doesn't know anything about chords, right? The brainstem just goes sound, no sound, frequency, right, location. So what it's telling you is that top-down information from musicians about what they know about chords is actually able to inform and shape the response in the brainstem. So this is really interesting because it's telling us, and I think we know this, but this is really showing us at a very low level that the experience that you have changes even low levels of the system because of feedback and interactions. And so I think this is clearly what we'd like to say here is that interaction between these top-down and bottom-up processes is very likely to or can produce changes or can shape the brain at many different levels, not just at the level of simple auditory or motor processing. So I will stop here. I will just say that, sorry, I thought I was going to stop, but I'll just give you two more. I'll just say, and I think, again, people are thinking about this, is of course there are a lot of other factors that might contribute to this sensitive period effect, right? So there's pre-existing individual differences, genetics, right? There's early musical environment, so family or exposure. Kids who go to music lessons when they're 3 or 4 do not likely say, Mom and Dad, I want to go to music lessons. It's Mom and Dad who say, let's go to music lessons, right? So there are going to be differences probably in terms of family interest, et cetera. So I think that to really tease this kind of thing apart, you're going to need some kinds of longitudinal studies. You're going to need heritability studies. There's already been some stuff done looking for genetic markers. but as you know, things like longitudinal studies are quite complex and can be difficult to implement. So maybe I'll stop here. I wanted to show you some of the stuff about the gesture, but I don't know whether you want to take more time or, okay. So I'll make this quick because there are some people who were curious. I'll just thank my collaborators on this, so the students and Robert. Yes, yes. Well, so I think this is an interesting question, right? So you're saying that kids who are younger have poorer motor control, right? So why would training them during that period when they've got poorer motor control be good for them, sort of, right? I think there's two ways you can think about it. We don't know, we only know that early auditory training seems to be good from like the AP results, right? So those people who get that auditory exposure early are more likely to develop AP. We don't know, from those studies that I did, it's visual motor, so we don't know about the auditory aspect of it. But what it does tell us is that that more fine motor part does seem to develop a bit later. So the idea would be is that by pushing the system, by training when they're still poorer, may actually help them to develop better control more quickly. That would be the hypothesis that you would have to make. And that auditory, the contribution of the auditory experience might also help to train the motor system, right? Because auditory information is very temporally accurate and can be processed extremely accurately. So it's likely the case that auditory experience can help to produce better motor performance, right? So it's got to be an interaction. The children? No. They had some of them were taking music lessons. They were really, but musical training didn't impact the results that we saw. It's really a simple motor task. It's a motor sequencing task. Yeah. Character? Or how does a person's character influence this? Right. Well, I mean, all I can say from what I have is that early training produces better adult performance, right? How that would interact with, sort of character is hard to say. I could answer maybe the other way around, is that you could think, and people have asked about this, that something about sort of motivational characteristics, sort of personality characteristics of a child might be relevant for whether they are successful early trained musicians, right? So a kid that's better able to exert sort of, or has better attention, better executive function, younger, might persist better in early training than another child. So that would be a kind of question that would be interesting to ask. We're not seeing adult differences in terms of these cognitive components, but it's possible that as children there might be differences. So you would need to look at differences between kids who train early and train late on some of these kinds of attentional measures, I think would be very interesting. Yeah. So just exposure, right? Yeah, so I think that that's really important as well, and that's another part that I think that would be quite interesting to know more about is just exposure in the home, right? So it's very different to be a kid who's going off to music lessons, but where music is not a real focus in the family, as opposed to kids who are in, say, a family of musicians, where they're getting a lot of exposure, they're hearing a lot of music, they're maybe going to concerts, seeing performers, et cetera. And that clearly could make a difference. We're starting to get some information about that by asking the people in these studies who in their family plays musical instruments. So you kind of get an idea of sort of like density within the family of musicians. So I can, and there, anecdotally, we know there are these families that are super dense musical families. Like, so somebody like Pablo Casals, his dad was training he and his sister when they were 3, 4, and 5, right? He was a musician, and he was making sure they got things right. So that's a big difference between just sending the kid to lessons and having a family member who's really pushing it. Sure. No, I can't really. We haven't done like a really direct comparison. I think the thing to remember is that you wouldn't, I mean, the question you're asking is very good, so I don't mean to like just skate around it. But so I think it is really interesting because what that can help you know about is you can imagine that there are regions that are going to show change with training and over time that are task relevant, but are also maybe globally relevant for doing all kinds of musical tasks. Whereas in the fMRI study, you're seeing all task relevant regions. So if in my fMRI protocol they have to use working memory, or they have to make a button press response, or they have to look at some visual, right? There may be areas that are related to doing that task, but that aren't, you would not expect to show changes related to musical training. But I still think that your question is a really good one, and I think that that is going to be a real, that is part of the reason why we chose to do tasks in this study where we're looking at structure that had already been used in fMRI tasks, so that we can make a closer comparison, because it can help us know perhaps more about which are the regions that are really specifically relevant for this kind of behavior. So, yes. So I'm just going to tell you really briefly. I'm going to try to tell you in like 2 minutes. Because there's some people who are interested in performance and more motor imitation. So I think all of you know that about mirror neurons, right? Which are the cool neuron in the brain right now. And a big focus of, or a big concept in the theory of mirror neurons is that the reason why mirror neurons are so useful to us is because they allow us to look at other people's behavior and to use that information to instruct our own behavior. So one of the ideas that people have put forward is that mirror neurons are useful to children learning language, because you can watch somebody else's lips move and whatever, and you can learn about language, and that it's important for kids learning to do other kinds of complex motor tasks, so we can think about music or skating or soccer or whatever. But the majority of studies of mirror neurons have used movements that people already know how to do, or that are things like reach and grasp, which we think are not learned in the same kind of way that complex motor tasks are. So things like reach and grasp develop from primitive movements that kids show sort of no matter what, unless they have some sort of brain injury or whatever, and that the sculpting of those movements probably occurs in a different way. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to find some kind of a complex motor task that people could do, that we could look at imitation behavior, and that we could look at the relationship between your ability to learn some sort of a new complex motor task and your ability to learn other kinds of motor things. So what we chose was sign language. So we developed this task where people look at a sign language word or a little phrase, and then on a videotape, then they get a little auditory cue, and then they have to imitate it. And just to sort of validate the task, we did it with musicians and non-musicians. But let me just show you, I think the fun part is to actually see what a stimuli looks like, and to see somebody trying to do the task. So, let's see. So here is one of the stimuli. Okay. So let's see him do it again. I'm learning a new motor task because my mouse is switched. Okay. So this is a relatively simple one. And then let's see if I can good. So here is our intrepid volunteer. And watch. You're not supposed to say that. So, same, different. Different, yeah. Yeah, so she got the basic idea, but she went the wrong way, right? Right, exactly. So this is an example of the kind of stimuli that we used. We had a variety of levels of complexity. Some of them were single-handed gestures, kind of like finger spelling, and some of them used two hands, but one hand was basically static, and some of them were more complex. And what we did is we videotaped the responses of people. We had them rated offline by raters who were blind to whether they were musicians or non-musicians. And we were able to show that musicians performed better than non-musicians at this task. And that in particular, they performed better. So sorry, I'm whizzing through this. So these are the simple gestures, the complex gestures. Musicians are better than non-musicians at both. And then the other thing that we did is we looked at the components. So did you get the arms right, the hands right, and the fingers right? And the particular place that musicians showed the greatest difference was at the fine level of the fingers. So did you get the finger position or the order correct? So I just wanted to really quickly show this to you, just to say that we think this is a really intriguing paradigm, and that we're hoping to use, well, we are currently developing a study in collaboration with some people in the UK. They're the people who did the juggling study. So they looked at changes in brain structure as people learned to juggle. And what we're going to do is we're going to test those same people who learned how to juggle on the imitation task and look to see if there's a relationship between your ability to do this imitation task and your ability to learn another complex motor task like juggling. So that would be, I think, a strong test of this idea that something like mirror neuroning, or using your mirror neurons, is actually relevant for learning a new task. And the other reason that I like this task is that I think that it's relatively transparent. We'd like to use it in children. So you could think about looking at this kind of a task in relation to kids' ability in music lessons. Because if you have the idea that something like watching somebody else do something like demonstrate how to play a chord on the piano is relevant, or demonstrating bowing, then you would think that kids who could do this task might be do better in music lessons. And it might, and I think also just from a basic science point of view, it really might help us form that link between the idea of mirror neurons, mirror system, and actual acquisition of a new task. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your patience. So I think that that's a really good question. And I think that there are sort of two answers. One is that, yeah, music is just an example. So you would clearly think that other kinds of early training would result in their own type of specific changes. So that's very clearly true. Music is really advantageous because it is relatively easy to quantify, but that doesn't mean you couldn't do it with sports. One of the things that we see with musicians is that so one thing that can be advantageous with musicians is that they play one thing. Many people who play sports play lots of different things. So you'd have to think very carefully about what you considered to be training and everything, but this is not to say that it couldn't be done. Another thing, we were talking about this last night, that's really special about sports is that there are some kinds of sports, and particularly sports that are highly reliant on early training. So if you think about things like ice skating, so figure skating, gymnastics, there are physical changes that occur in the body with development that mean if you don't have that early training, you cannot do the sport. So you'd have to think carefully about the kinds of sports that you would use. I would think soccer would be a really good one. But again, you want to think about what is it that you really think people learn when they learn to play soccer, right? Yeah. So I think I'm going to defer to Julia on the ballet dancing, but one of the things with ballet dancing is that in terms of that early late training thing, it's quite difficult because you cannot be a ballet dancer at a certain level if you don't begin training before a certain age because of the physical changes that occur in the body. So that those children are actually, it's not just training, it's actually like the length of their tendons and the positioning of their hip joints and all kinds of things like that that are changed. But there's probably ways that you could get around that by looking at particular aspects of performance that you think are more about, like you said, sequential regulation of action. And it would be fun to do something like those gesture imitation tasks with dancers who you would assume would be kind of through the roof in terms of performing. Right. I think that's a really excellent question. But the phoneme discrimination task here that we used is really more like a control for, so the task is something like babi, giga, dadu. And all you're trying to see is, did one of those change? So it's really more about it like an attention to the elements in the sequence. I think, yeah, like a working memory task, exactly. So I think your question is a really good one. From the work that we did together with Joyce Chen, where we worked on these auditory motor integration in terms of rhythm, I think that there is strong evidence that there is sort of a preferential interaction between auditory and motor system. So that this sensitive period, in terms of that auditory motor interaction, should be relevant for language. One of the things that's really interesting to me as a more motor person is, like you said, the idea of pronunciation. Because, as you may have noted, when I spoke to you briefly in Spanish at the beginning, my accent is not perfect. And even in French, which I've spoken for much longer, my accent is still non-native. As opposed to like Robert speaking in English and in Spanish, his accents are native in both, right? So I think that kind of interaction would be relevant. And what's really interesting is that, to my knowledge, because I've actually looked around for this, there aren't very many good measures of pronunciation that aren't really laborious. In other words, you've got to make people pronounce, and then you've got to get a native speaker to rate it on a scale of 1 to 7. How good was their pronunciation and everything? I think it would be a really interesting thing to look at is the relationship between pronunciation performance, auditory motor integration, and this sensitive period idea.
After the training period, you stop. Or you train for some years,
That
then
is
you
a
stop.
great question.
Do you lose the ability?
So this is a really good question. This is the group that we would really like to do. I didn't put it